Thank you very much, Luke. It's great to be here. I feel like I've had a bit of a crash course in human ecology today. I'm a bit of a newbie to the whole field, but it's been very exciting to hear what's going on. When I first put in the proposal and started thinking about human ecology, I realized that there are deep connections between what I'm doing and the concerns of human ecology, and I'll try and bring some of those out as I speak. So, am I a bit loud? No? I'm okay. Yeah, so let's just jump on to the next slide. Just before I go on, I'll acknowledge my wonderful supervisors who have been working with me on my PhD, my collaborators and funders. You can maybe see the writing. If not, I'll give you them later. Okay, so the title of my talk, and indeed of the piece which I'll play to you shortly, comes from a phrase in Philip Hoare's wonderful psychocultural history of whales and whaling, Leviathan or the Whale. Hoare was writing about the mark or fluke print left by the tail of a passing whale on the surface of the ocean, a slick of flat water as still as a pond, even in rough seas. According to Hoare, early whalers would refuse to cross such a trail, believing that to do so would jinx their hunt. He also tells us that the Inuit peoples of the Arctic declined to break its spell out of respect, seeing this Kala, the path of the unseen whale, as the animal's mirror into our world and our mirror into its own. Now, this may be a somewhat romanticized view. The Kala has also been described simply as our way of being able to follow the whale, with the size of the print giving information on the size of the whale being hunted. But nonetheless, it was one that resonated with me during a period of intense listening to a particular field recording of humpback whale song. And this, coupled with the experience of actually seeing some fluke prints being laid down by humpbacks in the South Pacific, led eventually to the piece of music, which I'll play to you at the end of this talk. But before I do that, I'd like to provide with some context to the piece, beginning with a short account of humankind's recent dealings with cetaceans, the general term for whales and dolphins. Focusing on past commercial whaling and the current threat posed by anthropogenic noise. I'll then talk about humpback whale song and how it has been studied by scientists and musicians, trying to give you a sense for why the vocalizations of this species in particular have been considered both beautiful and scientifically interesting. I'll describe the processes behind the composition of my piece, and finally consider briefly whether practices of what I shall call multispecies musicking have anything to contribute to a radical human ecology. But let's get to the whales themselves and consider some of humankind's recent interactions with them. So I'm going to focus, as I said, on the commercial hunting of whales, which dates back at least to the Basque whalers of the 16th century. From this period until the late 20th century, a succession of whalers using the technologies of their time successfully pursued and hunted populations of several species of great whales to commercial extinction. In a fatal and familiar spiral of capital and innovation, new forms of harpoons, bigger and faster boats, and factory-scale processes enabled even the largest whales to be hunted, butchered, and rendered at sea. By the mid-20th century, there was general agreement in the whaling industry that global populations were in steep decline, and in 1946, the International Whaling Commission, or IWC, was founded by a group of whaling nations, including the UK. The task of the IWC was to ensure that whaling was sustainable. Stocks of different species were identified and catch quotas issued based at least partially on the best available science. Unfortunately, ecology was in its infancy, the profit motive was strong, and the regulation by the IWC was pretty disastrous. So this slide shows you the catches through the 20th century in the northern and southern hemispheres of the large whales, catches which amounted to nearly 3 million whales during the course of the century. So the size of these catches meant that population declines continued, and by the late 1950s, many populations of blue, fin, humpback, right, grey, and bowhead whales were in severe danger of local extirpation or even global extinction. Fortunately for all of these whales, the voice of the humpback, discovered in the 1960s, turned out to be extraordinarily persuasive. So what you've heard there is taken from the album cover, which is reproduced here, Songs of the Humpback Whale, which was issued in 1970 by biologist Roger Payne. The songs were recorded off Bermuda. They rapidly seemed to capture the Western public imagination in much the same way that the image of Earth from space had done a few years earlier. The recordings ended up being played at meetings of the IWC, on the floor of the US House of Congress, and even from Greenpeace's boats directed at Russian whaling vessels. Not only this, but Roger Payne passed copies of song recordings among musicians, many of whom were inspired to write songs or symphonies in response, and thereby amplified the reach of the humpback's own song. As a result, as Payne put it, the whale became a musician, and for many in the Western world, killing and eating a whale became morally on a par with killing and eating a human musician. On a policy level, the result of anti-whaling campaigning has been that the IWC, which started out as a body to ensure the sustainability of whaling, slowly became one to ensure the conservation of whales, passing a moratorium on the commercial hunting of large whales in 1982. Subsequently, there have been notable recoveries in many species. We often see these kinds of pictures on the BBC News website or on the news. Large populations of southern right, bowhead, humpback, fin whales have all been sighted where they have not been sighted before. So, despite these recoveries, the moratorium has remained in place, although it has been bitterly contested. And then indeed, Norway and Iceland continued, and Japan has recently resumed commercial whaling, although on a much reduced scale. It's important to note that although a species may be secure in certain parts of the ocean, other populations may still be endangered as a result of local whaling history or other factors. So it would take much more time than I have available to talk about the complexities and politics of the pro and anti-whaling arguments, and I have completely neglected both Aboriginal subsistence whaling and the continued hunting of smaller whales and dolphins that is not regulated by the IWC. But I just want to bring out one point that has been made compellingly by the Norwegian anthropologist Arne Kalland. This is that for many of us in the Western world, the attractive qualities of the various species of whales have been kind of lumped together into an anthropomorphized image of a super whale that has come to symbolize nature. So here's my little cartoon image. The whale is large like the blue whale. It's intelligent like the killer whale. It's social like the sperm whale. It's songful like the humpback. You get the picture. Everything, all these attractive qualities we lump together into one kind of image of the whale. So Kalland, whose book is largely putting the pro-whaling case from the perspective of small-scale whaling in Norway and Japan. Kalland argues that one effect of this image is that the whaler, so the whale has come to symbolize nature, and the whaler has come to symbolize the destruction of nature. And consequently, the discourse around whaling has become extremely polarized. And I think this gives us one way of understanding the moral tone to the anti-whaling arguments I've already gestured at through Roger Payne's words. And it also suggests why the anti-whaling nations in the IWC have not accepted arguments that with the ongoing recovery of populations, the hunting of some species could be sustainable, and rather have shifted towards general arguments based on animal welfare and animal rights. Now, in general, I'm happy to accept those arguments based on animal welfare and animal rights, but I do want to make the point that if we do accept them, then we need to continue to be concerned about a number of other threats, not just whaling, to the well-being of whales. Nonetheless, bearing Kalland's point in mind, we need to be alive to difference and particularity. The members of the different species have different sensitivities to threats posed by entanglement, ship strikes, plastic pollution, climate change, and anthropogenic noise. Today I'm just going to go into a little bit more detail on the last of these threats. So, as a musician, underwater noise pollution seems to me to be one of the most invidious disruptors of cetacean life. Because it happens largely below the waves, where we humans do not spend a lot of time, it goes practically unnoticed by us. But as scientists have been pointing out for decades, noise pollution can have disastrous consequences for cetaceans and other marine life. And levels of human-made sound are rising steadily. Noise pollution is often classified, according to its source, into three main groups, as seen in this schematic: general ship noise, seismic surveys, and sonar. So I'm just going to play you some audio clips representing those three sources of sound. That's general boat noise. That, believe it or not, is called an air gun. They're used in seismic surveys. That noise will continue for hours, days, weeks at a time along vast trenches of the ocean where surveys being done for oil and gas exploration, largely. Finally, some sonar for you. So these clips come from a website from the recent documentary Sonic Sea, which I thoroughly recommend. The effects of sounds like these can be devastating because sea creatures rely so heavily on sound for their survival. All whales use sound for communication, mate selection, and predator avoidance. And in addition, the toothed whales have evolved echolocation capabilities to hunt their prey in the dark depths of the ocean. Sudden loud sounds, like those explosions you just heard, can damage hearing, and military sonar has been implicated in some mass strandings of deep-diving species, such as we saw occurring along the west coast of Scotland in 2018. Here I'd also like to recommend to you the recent art music collaboration on sonorous seas. There's a set of podcasts online. Furthermore, any anthropogenic noise can lead to whales altering their behavior, leading to additional energy costs, disrupting their foraging and so on. And perhaps more importantly, it can also drastically reduce the range and effectiveness of the communication network that plays such an important role in their social relationships. So what I'll do now is come back to humpback whale song, probably the most elaborate vocalization of all the many species of whales. A question that I often ask myself is, what was it about humpback song that led people to listen to it as if it were music? And I'd like to call this the zoömusicological approach. So this approach is one that I've been using myself in listening to and studying the music-like qualities of humpback song from both practical and more theoretical standpoints. In zoömusicology, as Hollis Taylor writes, we acknowledge and value the aesthetic qualities of non-human animal song, attempting to avoid a naive anthropomorphism at the same time. But before I talk about how this played out in one of my compositional responses, I'd like to give you just a short overview of humpback song from a biological perspective. And here I found it helpful to think about it in relation to some questions which are really easily stated. Who sings? When? What do they sing? And why? So the answers to the first two questions are now fairly well known. It seems to be only males that sing, although both male and female humpbacks produce what are referred to as social sounds. Male humpbacks sing primarily on the breeding grounds, which suggests a possible answer for the why question, i.e. that the primary function of song is, as for many songbirds, to advertise for a mate, or possibly to establish a dominance hierarchy among males. The third question, the what question, is the one that has interested me most as a musician. The first thing to note is that all the males in a particular population sing a version of the same song, but that this song is constantly changing, evolving from one season to the next. The fact that this happens shows us that humpback whales are excellent vocal learners, that they can change their song in response to what they hear. The phenomenon of song change has fascinated biologists, in part because it is so rare outside of humans. It also means that that North Atlantic song that I played you at the beginning, which so captivated the Western ear in the 1970s, has now gone forever. But I'd like to come now to something rather more basic, yet still fascinating to me, the sounds themselves and the way in which they are organized. So the first thing to note here is that the sounds generally almost entirely fall within the range of human hearing. And indeed, the pitch range covered by a humpback whale is approximately that of a grand piano. The sounds are amazingly diverse, ranging from noisy grumbles through low groans and moans to pure high whistles. Indeed, some humpback song scientists have identified hundreds of different song units. When it comes to how these song units are put together, how they are composed into phrases, if you like, we see some similarities with human music. A typical song consists of short phrases containing 2 or 3 different sound types, which may last for 10 to 30 seconds, let's say. So I'm going to give you an example here from French Polynesia, recorded by one of my supervisors, Ellen Garland, with Michael Poole. Okay, so some of you may have been able to see the moving green line there, which was basically tracking through this spectrogram, a bit like playing a musical score. I should have explained perhaps time runs horizontally, pitch runs up and down, yeah, what you heard there was 2 phrases, a repetition of the same phrase, which I boxed here in orange. Once a humpback has sung a few repetitions of a particular phrase, it moves to another set of sound units. Okay, so what we've heard there are 2 different phrases. Sets of repetitions of phrases are called themes. A set of themes, a sequence of themes is called a song. At any one time, that song might last between 5 and 30 minutes, and the humpback itself might sing for 20 hours at a time, just looping around and around that song. So we see that humpback song organization is not so dissimilar in its treatment of the repetition and variation of its materials to many kinds of human music. So I'm going to come now to a particular piece of music that I wrote in 2019, taking Philip Hoare's phrase as a title. It uses repetition and variation of a number of short humpback-like sounds played on the bass clarinet and prolonged with the aid of some interactive electronics over a backdrop constructed from a field recording. The lines in the upper half of the score are performed on the bass clarinet. The lines in the lower half indicate the field recordings. So the piece came about following my first intensive immersion in listening to humpback song. I was learning how to categorize the different sounds in the way of a humpback scientist, and found myself listening over and over to the recording from French Polynesia that I just played you some sections from. I don't think it's too extreme to state that this kind of deep listening can lead you to appreciate everyday sounds in a radically new way. After a couple of hours with my headphones on, I'd hear the sound of a door creaking and attempt to analyze it as though it were a humpback song unit. But the other thing that began to happen is that I got fixated on the sounds between the humpback song units, a mixture of humpback echoes, wave sounds, against the constant crackling background of snapping shrimp. You may have already noticed them in that recording. For the scientists, these sounds are unimportant. They're just referred to as noise. But for me, they had a life all of their own. As part of my scientific work on rhythm, I tried to isolate the humpback song units, and this has left me with a pattern of such sounds. So what we have here is a screenshot from my digital audio workstation, and again, time runs horizontally. This time, the size of the blob indicates the volume of the sound, the relative volume of the sound. And the large blobs on the top line represent the humpback song units. What you can see below that is what happens once I subtract those song units to different degrees. We get gaps, silences. A kind of happy accident, because the pieces with the silences only were not that interesting, or with the gaps still in. But once, accidentally, I subtracted all the gaps as well, and was left with what you see on the bottom line there. And I'll just play that to you now. To me, it was immediately appealing. So for me, there's something uncanny to this sound. You know there's something living in there, something alive producing those noises that you can hear, but there's no repetitive structure. It's very hard to pin it down. It's something you can't identify. So looking at the images like the ones that you've got here and listening to the audio files, I also realized that I had a sonic analogy to those flute prints that I showed you at the start of my talk. Both flute prints and audio traces are patterns of absence that mark past presence. This idea of absence and presence leads swiftly, of course, to the notion of extinction. And here I come back to population thinking. Although the humpback as a species is recovering well, in French Polynesia, where this recording comes from, it was hunted to near extirpation as late as the 1960s by Soviet whalers, and this population is still classified as endangered on the IUCN Red List. I also thought of the slow process of cultural forgetting, extinction if you like, that occurs inevitably as a result of the processes of song change that I referred to earlier. It came to me that if humpback whales were to become extinct, then the sonic space that they'd previously occupied would eventually come to be filled with human-made noise pollution, the clatter of boats, seismic air guns, and sonar. But around the same time, I'd been working on another piece in which I'd made some transcriptions of the humpback song units to play on bass clarinet. I realized that I could use these transcriptions in place of the humpback song units I'd cut out from the field recordings to create my own version of some of its themes. The gaps or sonic flute prints would first of all be filled with my own somewhat clumsy mimetic gestures made in homage to the great humpback singers. But to represent the threat to their voices, I'd gradually move to playing static tones, filling the sonic flute prints, and gradually coming to play in whale time. Humpback sounds gradually replaced with those of human music. Coming back to Philip Hoare's words, I hope that as this happened, the process would offer an acoustic mirror into the world of a humpback. I even fantasized that if a humpback were to listen to my piece, through the combination of my sounds and its rhythms, the whale might just experience it as a mirror into our own. So in a moment, I'll play you that piece. But before I do so, if I have time, I'll just touch on the question of what a multi-species musicking might have to do with human ecology. Whilst preparing for the symposium, I read the inspiring introduction to the 2012 volume, Radical Human Ecology, which you're all very familiar with, I'm sure. In this piece, Lewis Williams, Rose Roberts, and Alistair McIntosh ask what the future path should be for human ecology, and they offer three possible futures. Firstly, to help the planet die comfortably. Second, to recenter interiority and knowing of the metaphysical aspects of reality alongside the seemingly more tangible, objective, material concerns of everyday life. Or finally, decentering human consciousness and activity in ways that open the space to the possibility of a much more encompassing form of ecological alliance and intelligence. As the authors point out, these three possible pathways have different implications for human ecology practice. And what struck me is that there's also a potential tension, or a particular tension, between the second and third of these pathways, which demand that on the one hand, the recognition of the importance of human consciousness, subjectivity or interiority, and on the other, the movement of its decentering, which has commonly been associated with the so-called anti- or post-humanist position, i.e. one that ceases to privilege an autonomous and or rational human subjectivity, and rather takes as primordial the fact that we are always already situated in a world. So my hunch is that one line for dissolving this tension would be to consider the role of the arts. It seems to me that when we adopt an aesthetic attitude in listening to the sounds of the more than human world, i.e. listening to them as if they were music, we open ourselves up to the ethical call of the more than human other. That, in admitting bat, bird, seal, and whale vocalizations into the realm of aesthetic considerability, we're loosening the bonds of anthropocentrism. We're opening up another possible route into what Williams, Rose, and McIntosh call ecological alliance and intelligence. We're recognizing, or at the very least allowing ourselves to contemplate, the possibility of non-human forms of creative expression, of recognizing that our environment consists of an ecology of selves. We're questioning one of the crucial binaries with which Cartesian man has so commonly defined himself as unique. So we've got the decentering part covered. At the same time, art and music is nothing without subjectivity, or even an intersubjectivity. That is the site of artistic experience, of the encounter. We don't have to get metaphysical to make claims about a transcendental subject or a transcendent reality. Whether we're listening to a piece of music or the song of a blackbird, we value it not for its objective qualities, but for those raw feelings that arise from the immediacy of subjective encounter between our senses and the singer. This encounter is irreducible, as I say, to an objective or scientific account of that experience. So perhaps zoömusicology and analogous disciplines in the other arts can offer one way for human ecologists to simultaneously value and decenter human subjectivity. Okay, thanks. I'm now going to just set up very briefly for the performance of the piece. So do talk amongst yourselves for a couple of minutes. Thanks.
Wow. Wow, thank you so much, Alex. I feel quite subaquatic. Still that had a consciousness shifting effect, which was very, very powerful. So thank you so much for that fascinating lecture recital. Is there maybe just a couple of brief questions for Alex? Or, Ulrich.
I don't have to be first, but okay. Two questions. An obvious one, it's terribly down to earth, but I was very impressed with everything. What happens if you play your clarinet to the whales? And I'm sure you're asked that often.
It's a lovely question. And in fact, there's a musician called David Rothenberg who's done exactly that. I haven't had the opportunity to do it. And in fact, there's some problematic aspects of doing it because it probably plays a role in the mating system.
Right.
You'd be introducing some new culture which might get picked up, might get copied, might play havoc with things. So I think it would be quite hard to persuade the university ethics committee to allow that. Having said that, they're very robust creatures. They seem to be quite stable in response to other sound, non-humpback sounds. So, yeah, if I had the chance, maybe I would.
That's great. My other question was whether you'd met David or know him.
Yeah. No, I know David well. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah.
Towards the end of your piece, it seemed to me you were playing arpeggios with augmented and diminished notes, particularly high up. Did you have to adjust the background, or do whales naturally sing without going into perverse microtones?
Well, that's a nice question. Humpback whales have a lot of sound units which just kind of swoop through all kinds of pitches. However, if you look at them, sometimes you have to listen to them in slow motion, so to speak, put them under the microscope, you see that they're built up of natural harmonics. So, I was just using well-tempered sounds towards the end of the piece. That was partly deliberate to represent, if you like, the human music rather than, a certain form of human music which tends to rely on that scale rather than weird, if you like, harmonics and microtones.
Two quick ones, if I may. One is, I work with farm animals, as they're called, but they're animals. And my observation over time with my teacher, Mart Kylie Withington, and with myself, my animals, so to say, is that they pick up horses, cows, not so much sheep, but I don't know them enough. They pick up on conversation skills. That is, the more you talk with them, the more they understand the concept of talking to each other, conversing. And that seems to develop really, really quickly. These cows I have only for 1 year, they already have changed their communication tremendously from very loud and kind of disturbed and assuming that they were not going to be heard to distinctly knowing that they're going to be heard and now modulating what they're saying in order so that it gets the result which they expect that I will give, etc. Yeah. So I wonder if, and also use music, but lots of people do now, music with horses because they're very responsive to. So I wonder if other people are doing this sort of work with what we call farm animals, like you're doing. And that's one question. And the other is this, at the end of this piece, I was in space. And there's such a connection between the aquatic space and outer space. I wonder if that is necessary for us, this work, to attain a different level of being that would be useful to go in space, in cosmic space.
Great questions, right. I'm going to take the second one first, if I may. So I think the connection between inner space and outer space, if you like, is a really deep one. And I think in the 70s there was a kind of change of consciousness, if you like, and people became, obviously outer space had been, the exploration of outer space had started, but at the same time it became obvious that we know so little about the oceans, that space, and somehow that became another realm of space which connected more maybe to our inner states, or amongst a large population, a large section of the population. I mean, why that is, I don't know. And I don't know. I mean, I suppose maybe one thing about the sounds that happen underwater is that you do tend to get these echoes, delays, which put you in the mind of being in a big space, a familiar big space like a concert hall or a cathedral or something, and that's something that I was playing with there. But I'm sure there's a lot more to it. To the farm animals, I'm not aware of people working with. At the moment, I'm not particularly aware of people working with their sounds in a musical context. I mean, there were some recordings made by a guy called Jim Nolman in the 70s and 80s. He recorded some pieces with turkeys, I mean, the sounds that cows can make are very similar in some ways to some of the sounds that humpbacks make. I think the interesting thing for a musician is that it's the structure in the humpback song. You find repetitions at multiple levels, which show that there's a kind of hierarchical organization of those sounds, and that's very rare in the animal kingdom generally.
One final question from Svenja.
Thank you. That was absolutely stunning. And I also, because I saw you play before in the tramway, and I think I was struck by also the healing potential and also the sort of community aspect of bringing lots of people together. It was like speakers on a ramp, and it was resonating with the sounds, and there were lots of groups from like daycare centers and like different groups attending, and it was just really special. And I think that kind of interspecies communication has like so much potential to bring people together and experience sort of something a bit, to reconnect in different ways. Yeah, I mean, the piece you mentioned is an installation called Human Threads, which was on a tramway for a long time over this summer. And one of the wonderful parts of the exhibition was a large blue ramp. Like the length was the width of this room, and it was about 20 feet wide. Went up to about so high. But the important thing about it is that it's basically a large speaker. It had 9 massive transducers underneath it. You could play sound into the ramp, and I was indeed playing some whale song and some bass clarinet sounds into the ramp. So the audience is a very kind of open, free, wander in, wander out, wander around kind of audience, and you're invited to lie down on the ramp and feel the sounds through your back. And it was a really special, really lucky opportunity for me to be able to put some of those sounds through that ramp. And I really agree. It has some immense therapeutic potential. Just the frequencies of the sounds.
Can I just jump in with a quick question? Just earlier on, we were in the tuning workshop, and we were listening to that. There was a lot of similarity in it. So I suppose my question is, do whales mourn each other? Do they have songs for different parts of their life?
I think there's some evidence that they do mourn for each other, and there are stories of killer whales and dolphins pushing dead offspring around in front of them for weeks or months. I I think it's unlikely that they have special songs for mourning. It might be that amongst dolphins and killer whales, there might be some sounds that they use. Those species don't sing in the way that we would recognize as song. And humpback song doesn't really change according to the context around it. So it's a lovely idea of it.
Yeah, just one last thing. I was incredibly moving. Thank you very much. I was at the back on the floor. I wanted to
Thank you.
move around. I thought that was the best representation ever of post-humanism that I've ever heard. So I'm going to carry a wee recording around of that in my pocket. Someone asked, "What's post-humanism?" Here it is.
Great. Thank you
So
very
thank you very much. Beautiful.
Cheers.
Thank you. Well, once again, thanks to Alex South.